What's going on, cultivators of the future? You are currently tuned in to Ask Their Education. I am your host and facilitator, as always, Robert Astwood. And once again, we have what is called an inquiry session, an interview. And today on the show, we have Professor Thomas Hatch. Introduce yourself. Go ahead. Let them know about you.
Hi, Robert. I'm really delighted to be here and to have this chance to talk with you. I am a professor at Teachers College at Columbia University, and I'm also the director of the National Center for Restructuring Education, Schools, and Teaching.
Awesome. So I usually like to lead out with, talking about your research interest and then asking like a big, purpose question. So what would you say is your main research interest? What are you studying?
So right now, my work really focuses on issues of system change in terms of, really rethinking and developing schooling for future and thinking about as, what I talk about as a future we can't predict. And it tries to combine the challenges of improving the schools we have, but at the same time trying to reimagine schooling altogether, because as many of us, have argued, the schools we have are just inadequate in terms of what we really want to accomplish for all of our students.
I'm getting excited because education reform is like my main purpose. Like that's the thing. I feel like I need to reform the education system from the ground up. Well, basically, we've got to tear out the neoliberalistic education kind of policies and values and whatnot to get that out of the way, and then rebuild it from the ground up on humanization, organic intelligence, whole child education, and things that really cultivate the full person and interdependence. So I really do want to talk to you about education reform. That's going to be our topic today. I do have questions. I have like a whole bunch. We're not going to get to them all of them. I have like about 15 or 16 of them, but I'll go through and see which ones are like the biggest heavy hitters. And let's see what you think. So this one is kind of like general. So what does education reform mean to you? Like, what is its overall purpose?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think education reform really is kind of a catch-all category for all kinds of sets of initiatives. And, so in those terms, the neoliberal reforms, policies that you've talked about from some people's perspective are, educational reforms. And then for other people, educational reforms are dismantling the accountability policies or the performance management work that's going on in schools. I think for me, the critical difference is between education reform and school reform. Because if you just focus on school reform, we're really talking about how to reform the schools that we have. Where, from my perspective, if we're talking about education reform, we're really talking about all aspects of the education system and really broadly about, learning altogether, which happens both inside and outside schools. So from my perspective, when I talk about education reform, I'm talking about how to create the supports for student learning and development that encompasses all those things that you talked about, all aspects of the person, not just academic development, and all that goes way beyond school reform.
I completely 1000% agree. I feel like the way that schools have been set up now, they only orient toward like very limited goals, and they produce very limited results. They focus. And you got to look at it like it's built, like the way education system, because I've been studying like the history and everything at Teachers College. And the way that our education history is like we needed it to kind of progress because there was a whole progressive era, right? So we needed it to kind of move our society forward. So I feel like we've gotten stuck in that. Like maybe that's what we needed it for before, but now it's like we're kind of relying on antiquated ideas, I feel like. And it's really holding us back because now we're still trying to focus on production, like, making money or like treating people. And look what we're doing. We're treating people as numbers, we're ranking them. So yeah, I feel like that's a big issue. What are the most important values in education to you? And are those values being prioritized in your school? If not, what can you do to change that?
So values and purpose. So you've already hit on sort of the fundamental issues here. From my perspective, values and goals are the heart and soul of not just the education system, but the society as a whole. And in the work that I've done studying both higher, quote unquote, higher performing education systems in terms of PISA and tests like TIMSS and things like that, as well as lower performing systems, the argument that I make is that we can't fundamentally change the systems that we have or improve the systems we have if we don't really examine and in many ways challenge the basic values that those systems have been built on. And so in some ways, for example, in this country, we have an inequitable system that reflects values that have reinforced those inequities and have established, systemic racism at the heart of the system. So they're values like individuality, accountability. Now, individuality in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. There's many aspects of that to embrace. But if we look at countries and systems like Finland, like Singapore, other countries, they also have an embrace for the collective and common good that I think is not always reflected in our society. So part of my concern in a system like the US is that we're trying to change the system while still embracing some of the same basic values that have put an inequitable and in some ways unsuccessful system in place in the first place.
So you make me think of two things. So one, I spoke with Daniel Frederick, professor in Teachers College, curriculum and teaching, and I actually asked him this question, do you think multiculturalism, being that we have so many different demographics here, because you mentioned exactly the same places I mentioned, Finland, Singapore, do you think they are doing better because of I know maybe their culture, their demographics is not completely homogenous, but do you think that it's harder for America to do certain initiatives or to shift certain values because of multicultural or because we have so many different cultures? What do you think? How do you think culture plays a role into making these strides toward a more equitable, more, how does that play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to one of the arguments is particularly countries like Finland that have a largely white population, much more so than in the US, and also with a fairly common, sociocultural heritage, that may somehow make it easier to create a particular kind of education system because there's more agreement. And that's why, I like to contrast Finland with Singapore, where it's not a homogenous system at all. In some ways, it's more diverse than the US in terms of religion. Certainly, in schools in Singapore, they embrace not just English, but mother tongue, in Chinese and Tamil, and support other languages and cultures directly in schools. And yet they are also able to be more successful. And then another, argument that people make is, well, Singapore is so much smaller and Finland in some ways. And, that of course is correct, but we do have districts, we have states that are smaller and that are units that I think could take advantage of some of what we can learn from these other systems in order to make improvements. But the other thing I point out, and I've written about this, I have a new book out, which is called The Education We Need for a Future We Can't Predict, but I've also, written about it in previous articles and some on my own blog. But countries like Finland and Singapore are actively engaged in developing a common understanding and a common concern around education across their public, whether it's homogenous or diverse. They don't just assume that people will agree, and move together to support the education system. They've put specific mechanisms in place to reflect on education and the education system, to consider the goals and the purposes that we should be aiming for, and to think about whether or not the system is achieving them, and then collectively to think about the directions we want to move in the future. And so from my perspective, this is one of the crucial aspects that we've failed to address in our education system, is how do we create the mechanisms at a local level so that communities, whether they're homogenous or diverse, can come together to discuss their different points of view on education and come to some common understandings about how we want to proceed together.
And you actually are already mentioning something kind of like leading into my other question I was thinking about, is how would you, because as we've already said at the beginning, uprooting the core curriculum and like really wanted to make kind of this widespread national change, like to just the way schooling is done. So how would you start? Like, because you mentioned local, and I do think that's where a good place to start is like local, each local school district. But what do you think? Like, how, if you want to do a national school change, like you want to have the whole way that school is even thought about and implemented on a national level, how do we start, like today? Like, where can we start today?
Well, it's another really interesting question. And I do think a lot of the locus and the work has to happen at the local level. And I've written a lot about the power of community organizing and the work that community organizers do to bring people together, to go door to door, to knock on people's doors and to say, you know, what do you care about? What's working in your schools, what's not, and to surface common interests that then can lead people to work together on initiatives that really matter. And that could be something as simple as, you know, trying to increase traffic safety outside of school. Could be building a playground. It could be getting a health clinic put in the school. It could be creating a new science program. Could be creating a new school altogether. So these are critical activities that have to happen at a local level. But if all we have are thousands of, you know, different communities doing their own thing, then it never really adds up to that national or systemic effort that we need to change things. And that's why I've argued that at the same time that we're doing this work at a local level, we also need to be developing the mechanisms and the capacities to come together across our communities and to develop, you know, the social movements that are not only going to change our schools, but that are going to create a much more equitable society. And so from in those terms, I think the climate change movement really has a lot of lessons to teach us in education. I really think the emergencies that we face in education, particularly around inequitable access to, you know, outcomes as well as educational opportunities, you know, it's as dire as the climate crisis. If we don't get this resolved, you know, within, you know, our lifetimes or the next generations, I think, you know, the fabric in our society can unravel completely. And, you know, for that reason, just like climate change, you know, we have work to do in our own houses. We've got to do the recycling. We've got to make sure our communities are clean, but we also have to come together, not only in the US, but around the world to work together to really transform the way we go about our daily lives. And that's the same thing we need to do in education. We need to make sure that we are addressing on a national and global level the inequitable access to outcomes and opportunities that are holding our societies and our education systems back.
It's such a beautiful statement, and I have so much more to add, but again, in the interest of time, so we've been talking about, you know, like what we want the future to look like, the good things, like what's the good that we're looking for, or like what's the values. But let's switch it on its head. Like, what do you think are some of the main items that are stymieing the progression of progressive education? Maybe I shouldn't say double progression, but you know what I mean.
Yes. Whatever vision we want. And I do think that identifying the conditions that hold us back is absolutely crucial. And I think the discussion around what's happened during the pandemic in schools is a really good case in point, because a lot of people are saying, some good stuff has happened in the US and other parts of the world. We've seen some experiments, some adaptation, maybe a little more personalized learning, maybe at least in some cases, some powerful uses of technology or distance learning. Some cases, communities have come together. There's been a recognition of the importance of embracing, the whole child and addressing socioeconomic, socio-emotional, and health concerns and supporting those. But in part, those adaptations have come about because the conditions have changed dramatically over the past year. We've closed school buildings and students have been at home. We've suspended testing. We've kind of, in some ways, reduced some of the academic pressures on students. But in fact, there's no reason to think that the conditions are not going to change back once, whether it's in the fall or the spring. It is likely that, many parents will not want their kids to be staying home while they're trying to go to their jobs. It's likely that the testing will come back. It's likely that the academic pressures will return. And some, the discussion around learning loss, it sounds like even more academic pressure may come on students, particularly those who've fallen behind further, as we kind of double down on academic instruction to try and, quote unquote, catch everybody up. So my point is that we can't expect things to change unless the conditions change. And there are at least three aspects of those conditions that I really feel are holding us back to come around to the key question you asked. And, one is that for most, in most cases, the purpose and the goals of schooling are to graduate high school, which requires, passing a set of academic qualifications. And then and then ideally to go on to college, which requires getting through a set of entrance requirements, which again, often involves standardized testing or other academic requirements, or entering the workforce, which then highlights again, either academic or a technical set of skills. So as long as those parameters remain in place, and they are the main and largely only major goals, there's not that much that can change. When you combine that with the fact that we need schools serve a very important purpose, which has almost nothing to do with education, but that its parents and families need somewhere for their kids to go while they go to work. And that work day is for many, but not everybody, but certainly for many, from 8 or 9 to 3 p.m. or something like that, where, students can be looked after. And, schools as containers with these, individual classrooms where you can put one teacher in there with 20 or 30 or 40, or as in, many parts of Asia, 50 kids, is a solution to that childcare problem. It's not a great setup for education and learning, however, particularly for personalized learning, or student-centered learning, if that's what you're interested in. So the question is, how much is going to change as long as that workday remains in place and we have that requirement for schools to fill that childcare function? And then the last, condition is that over the last 100 years or so, we've become accustomed to a certain kind of schooling and a perception about what real school and real learning looks like. And Mary Metz, a sociologist, talks about this. And so, in fact, every time we try to change schools and learning substantially, get students outside the classroom and support that kind of learning, there's a nagging sense in the back of our heads, oh, maybe they're not really learning. And maybe they're not learning what they need to do in order to, quote unquote, succeed in schools, which takes us back to those, basic academic requirements. So until those three things change, I don't know how much we can really transform schooling.
You're touching on like a really big concept in education, which I refer to as the concept of time, or the problem of time. And the problem of time is really the fact that we spend time covering stuff. Let's cover this, let's get through this, you know, and it's all within the goal of, like how you said, to get to the test, to teach the test, or like prepare you for some kind of standardized like assessment, you know, something like that. And hence time gets not wasted. Yeah, wasted because I feel like we're focusing on things that, like, I don't remember anything on the GRE. Like, not using that GRE information like now, you know, in my daily existence. It's not pushing me to become a better version of myself. Like, I'm not using that, you know? So what do you think, how in this like kind of, I know we can't predict the future, like how you say, in the future we can't predict, but in this future, like in like this idea or this school change environment, where does time come in? Like, how would time be, like what are your thoughts on time in the future of school change?
Well, I think, again, you're pointing to a really critical issue. So many of those pressures we just talked about, the need to focus on academic content and to get into college or to get a job, the need to, take care of children during the day, the expectations around what real learning or real school look like, all put pressure on us to use time in very conventional ways, in the same ways that we've always used them. They don't leave room for us to experiment with new practices or forms of learning that are different from what we've had in the past, or that embrace a wider set of developmental needs or capacities. And so part of my argument is that we're never going to make any progress until we confront this demands of time. And, so one of the arguments I made is, in fact, we need to cut the curriculum in half. If we want to embrace social emotional learning and support, civic and social and personal responsibility in schools, we can't do that by adding it on to the existing curriculum. We actually have to create space and time in the curriculum to support those things. Similarly, I would argue that rather than extending the school day and increasing the amount of time we spend on academics, we actually need to condense the school day. Teach academics in a more efficient and a more effective and more powerful way, so that we can spend less time doing it, and we can spend the afternoons in, learning outside, in communities, in projects, in students engaging in internships and others of those kinds of learning experiences that we think can be so powerful, but that we haven't had the time or the room to find within the school day. And, I don't think we can pretend these other pressures that lead us to concentrate on academics are going to go away. So I think we have to be very thoughtful and strategic about how we try to move forward. And that could be as simple as things like, for the AP exam, let's take out one topic every year, right? And slowly work our way to a more condensed curriculum. Or, let's shave a little bit of time off the workday until we can, make some adjustments. We can't just pretend that we can transcend these conditions, but we can find ways to challenge them and work around them.
Okay. All right. So we are virtually out of time, but I do have one final question. Well, I have more, but I'll limit it to just this one final question. And this is usually a question that I like to ask at the end of all my interviews. What is one thing, like, for our viewers, our listeners, whoever's watching, spectating, trying to get into the conversation, what is one thing that they can do today, like right now, to bring about this new environment, or bring about this area or this space where students are actually valued as people, where the whole child is centered, and humanization and organic intelligence are like at the forefront? Like, what can we do today?
Yeah, I mean, that is not an easy question. I think it depends a lot on sort of, where you are and who you are. Are you a grandparent? Are you are you retired and don't have any relatives or friends with, kids in the schools? Are you a teacher, an education leader, a policymaker? I think there are different entry points for all of us, but most of it really begins with developing a relationship with students in particular, but certainly with anyone who's working in a school right now, particularly in schools in our own communities, so we get a better understanding of what's actually happening, so that we're not just basing our ideas and our beliefs on what we think should be happening or what we think might be happening or what people have written about what's happening, but we have experiences that we can draw on, but more importantly, so that we can be forging those relationships, so that we can get a sense of what matters not only to us but to other people, and begin to use that foundation of relationships to move this work in our local communities and the social movements that are required to really transform education in our country and around the world.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Thomas Hatch, Professor Thomas Hatch, in the house today with the insights. I love it. Alrighty, well,
Thank you,
all
Robert.
the time. Of course, and of course, I'd love to see you back on the show. You gave me so many things to think about too. Like, I'm going to be watching this again. I mean, I have to watch them anyway to edit them, but I'm going to be watching this again, like, and taking notes, like, because I really like that idea you were saying about like the community, because I've been thinking about that myself, but like really just kind of moving forward with that, like, and you said grandparents, like, teachers, like education stakeholders. That's what I call them. Everybody, almost everybody is an education stakeholder. If you think education, not school.
Right.
So, but we'll definitely continue this on. Give them like a little outro, phrase. Let them know, finish this off.
Well, I just think that, the critical piece is that we both have to work to improve the schools that we have, at the same time that we're also working together to really transform education altogether.
Beautiful. All right, guys, you have been tuned in to Astor Education. I was your host, Robert Astwood. I've been joined today by Professor Thomas Hatch. Again, he came up with the great insights, loving it. And I'm going to be definitely check out his book, The Education in a Future That We Can't Predict, correct?
The education we need for a future we can't predict. Yeah.
Yes. It is available. It's on, I have the e-version. I got it off, I think, Amazon, but.
Yeah, or just go to the Corwin publisher site, or you can go to my website at thomashatch.org and you can find connections to it.
Awesome. All right, guys, look out for that. And thank you for tuning in. And remember, stay cultivating.